Hello, my name is Rossi. I worked at the Smithsonian Institution this summer under the mentorship of my fabulous advisor, Dr. Jan French. I'm an interdisciplinary major and an anthropology minor. And the name of my project from this summer is Storytelling, Cultural Narratives in Public Spaces within the Smithsonian Institution. So I don't have this picture up here to horrify you. I have it to demonstrate the civic value of public space and what we put in public space. This is a mural that was chosen for the South African Constitutional Court. And so it's actually a huge mural on the wall when you walk into the court, which is a public space anyone can go into. And it was chosen to honor apartheid. It was done by a South African artist. It was chosen especially to honor an uprising called the Soweto Uprising, which involved youth in South Africa during apartheid. And so if you look at the people, a lot of them are young people, but there's a problem with this mural. And the problem is that historically there's clashing narratives about what happened at this event. Historically, we know that a lot of youth were involved as people that were hurt through the violence that happened. We also know that a lot of youth were perpetrators. So this mural that was chosen for a reason. It was chosen to frame the narrative a certain way. And there's contrasting and conflicting perspectives about what happened. So this summer I worked in one of our most important national public spaces, which was the National Mall. And the National Mall is host to our free museums, which are the Smithsonian museums that anyone can go into. And they're really the basis and the platform for us to form cultural narratives as a country. So what they do is important to our story as Americans. So the first person that I met when I came in to work for the Smithsonian was a woman named Andrea Lather, and she was the director of visitor services for the American History Museum. The American History Museum is on the National Mall. It's probably the most visited museum, either that or natural history, but it's extremely popular. It has one of the widest audiences of all the museums. And they were working on opening, she was actually in charge of opening a new wing for that museum called American Enterprise. And as part of this wing, they wanted creative, kind of interactive parts of their exhibit that they were going to let the interns put on to work with audience members in kind of a creative way. And it was, my specific thing that I worked on was called the chocolate cart, which sounds kind of weird, I'll show you a picture later. But the chocolate cart is an interactive exhibition where I had a script of what I talked to people about, and it was kind of a creative interpretation of historical chocolate making. I didn't like dress up or anything. But everyone was interested and could touch all the objects they had and everything. So it was very creative, but when I initially got the script, I was like, yikes, this looks really boring. Like, what does this have to do with what I want to do as a civic fellow? But as I read, there was a part of the script that really stood out to me, and it was the part that said potential controversies. And what it read, this is verbatim, was potential controversies. Part of the story of chocolate production in the United States is the story of slavery in the United States and abroad. So I wanted to learn more about this, and I Googled chocolate and slavery, looking for historical articles on 19th century links between chocolate and slavery. And instead I found pictures from 2015 like this one. And I realized that slavery was not only a part of chocolate's past in the history, it is very much a part of chocolate's present. So there's a whole other layer that made this a problematic initiative for the museum. How are we going to address this? How are we going to convey this information to the audience in a way that didn't shy away from the controversy, but addressed it in a way that was easy enough to understand? My answer for you about how the Smithsonian handled the problem is that they didn't. So when I got my final script for doing this presentation, actually the part that I said, the controversial part about slavery, was cut out completely. There was no mentions, it was just referred to as a global enterprise. So that was interesting. And that wasn't the only problematic thing about the exhibit. The chocolate cart was an interactive part. It was like an extra on the exhibit, but the actual exhibit itself was a long room with giant cases that went from wall to wall. They were glass cases filled with artifacts. And so when someone walks into the exhibit, they walk in and they're faced with the case, and so they kind of curve around. The only mention of slavery as being a part of the American economy was on the side, like on the very side of the long row that was about the colonial economy. And it looked like this, and that's my co-intern Andrew, who's awesome. He went to the University of Miami. And we were both just kind of weirded out by that. And I just, not to read, but I think this is a really important quote, and it comes from an academic that I studied this year for part of the Civic Fellowship. His name is James Count Early. And he said, museums loom ever larger, museums loom ever larger as public spaces where the drums of Africa and the heart of citizens with African ancestry can be contemplated and displayed. Now, I don't know if this displays that, but I want to talk about a few other things that might. So, part of my job was also to work with public programming for the National Portrait Gallery. And this is a much smaller, kind of different museum. It's still part of the Smithsonian Institution. On my first day there, the director, Kim, who's an Australian woman who's a new director, came to us and said, okay guys, we're trying to skew this away from being a museum that celebrates old dead white men. We want diverse audiences. We want people to come in that are young. We want to attract different people. And a couple of ways they did this, or the pictures that I show, are that's Toni Morrison's portrait and a new exhibit called The Blacklist that also features like Chris Rock and different performers. And this is Oprah and Condoleezza Rice in a new exhibit called iPop that I worked on. And iPop is about celebrities that have made a difference, and it has like a pop art spin. So I think they're kind of attract people that with like the whole Andy Warhol revival and stuff. So that kind of worked. This is another thing that we were doing. So the museum itself was especially focused on attracting Hispanic audiences. That's how we talked about it in planning meetings. And they felt as though the museum should be bilingual. So this is a brochure that I made for one of our shows that my supervisor, Ian Cook, and I worked on. And it's a bilingual brochure that talks about the portraits in English and Spanish. And this is a presentation that we had with the director of Latino art for the Portrait Gallery, and we had her present on a portrait of Sonia Sotomayor that attracted a lot of people to come, and she talked about it. These initiatives were great, but what I noticed about them is that they didn't have a lot to do with the audience, and they had a lot more to do with how the Smithsonian and the Portrait Gallery wanted to depict itself. And what I mean by that is when we were planning these programs, and we were sitting around the table, and the director of education for the Portrait Gallery was talking, she would say things like, okay, we have this many acculturated Hispanic audience members coming, and this many of the general Hispanic population. Things of that nature, where it was very targeted to trying to say, the story that the Portrait Gallery wanted to give out was, we are a diverse museum. It wasn't necessarily reflecting the stories, the narratives, and the identities of the people that they were hoping to attract. But surprisingly, going back to the chocolate card, this did, in a very weird way. So like I said, they didn't bring up, they really framed their story about the narrative of chocolate in American history away from the controversy of slavery. So part of what I was doing, I didn't think it was going to be that interesting, but part of what I did when I was presenting was see these spices on the side. The audience members would smell them. And during one of my very first presentations, there's one spice that no one could catch. No one could guess it. And it's because it's not a smelly spice, it's a coloring spice. It's called annatto. And no one knew what it was in the whole audience, except for one woman named Maria. And there's like 30 people standing around my presentation. And Maria was like, oh yeah, it's annatto. And everyone was like, what is annatto? And she explained she's Puerto Rican. And she explained, well, annatto is a traditional spice that my mom would use. We used it for these holidays. It's used in the flavoring of rice. It's used in the coloring of these different things. We used it in cakes, blah, blah. And she was talking about the way that this spice was part of her heritage. It gave her a public platform and a voice. And this didn't just happen once, it happened all summer. So this is me doing a presentation for kids that came by. I had Spanish-speaking families come up to me every week that I did this presentation, and sometimes younger like children or grandchildren would translate to me what an older person in the family was saying. But I had a grandmother come up to me who was explaining, so I'm using the metate and the mono. That's like the big stone thing, and you can see better in this one. And the grandmother came up and was like, libertate! And she started talking about, she was translating through her grandson. I can kind of understand Spanish, so I know what she was saying. And she was kind of telling, the whole audience was kind of listening. She was talking about how they used it for Dia de Muertos to make a certain kind of cornmeal, how she had this in her house, how her grandmother had it in their house, how they used it traditionally, and the grandchildren were also verifying the story and talking about it, and it was fascinating. And I had no idea that there was this connection to Hispanic culture with these tools that we were using to depict colonial chocolate baking. So here's what I got overall out of the experience. Every nation needs a story. And telling the American story is really, really hard because we're a very diverse nation. We're different than a lot of other countries. And the other thing I want to say about stories is that a lot of people say, well, every story has two sides. As a student of anthropology, I would say no, every story does not have two sides. It has an infinite number of sides. Because so many people can interpret a different moment in time, a different context, a different situation in so many different ways. So there's so much that goes into portraying one story and trying to create an American story. But I feel as though the best tactic for trying to appeal to a diverse audience is to welcome them into a story, even in the smallest ways. And through that, in doing that, a lot of times creative means are the best means. So having an interactive exhibit that gave people a voice and a platform in a way that the exhibits on the walls of the Smithsonian really couldn't was really helpful because it gave them a way, it gave them a framework by which they could talk about their story and make an identity within a greater story, which the Smithsonian was trying to tell about America as a nation. And I think that always, like, public stories are something that we each need to relate to on an individual level, but it's also useful in the sense of uniting, which can be dangerous in the sense that for different reasons, different institutions want to frame their stories different ways. So like I talked about with the slavery controversy, they framed it away from that. But at the same time, stories can be very unifying and useful. And I think that opening stories in a way that gives people a way to identify themselves within a greater story, and often doing that means giving people a voice and a platform when often people that feel marginalized, is a really special way to do so. And so I feel like the Smithsonian in the future should keep using these types of interactive presentations and creative communication to attract an audience that is able to reflect themselves through what they see, rather than the museum trying to portray itself in a certain way. So.